if your mind goes to, I outsource my removals, which means I don't care about removals, like do whatever you want as long as you get the decedent in my care, I don't care. That's not how I would say that you should approach it. You should approach it with immense care so that you can actually mitigate the time that you actually have to spend managing that process. Proactively write out the list of expectations that every driver should execute on every single removal, do's and don'ts of your brand's removal, what kind of attire you want them to be in, what kind of van you don't want them to be in, what kind of vehicle you do want them to be in, depending on how that breaks down in their business, what information to take, what information not to take that you'll take the next day when you reach out, all of those things. This is really a process question. It's if you take the time to develop a perspective about how you want your removals to be done, I think that it's fair to communicate that with a third party and come up with an agreement of what you think is fair to pay that subcontracted service to do and execute those things for your business and manage them accordingly.
Welcome to the Direct Cremation Podcast with your hosts, Tyler Yamasaki and Will DeMichaelis. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Direct Cremation Podcast. I'm your host, Tyler Yamasaki, CEO of Parting Pro. And as always, I'm here with my co-host, Will DeMichaelis, former manager of the Omega Society, a cremation brand that once served up to 4,500 families in a year. Today, we're going to talk about one of the most important parts of the death care industry, and that is the removals. Specifically, we're going to discuss how to decide to do your own removals or to outsource them to others or a third party. Today, we do not have a guest, so it's a little bit of a different structure. But as you guys know, Will here has a wealth of knowledge when it comes to all things funeral home. And so we will be talking to him.
Yeah. Can't wait. This is an exciting topic. This is really an important part of the entire business process. So excited to dive in.
Yes. So hello, Will. Sorry, I don't have a flashy intro for you, but
I don't need a flashy intro. I'm, stay humble, stay hungry,
Yeah, we're good. Proud of you. Yeah. So let's go ahead and talk about removals. And I think what we should probably do is set the guidelines of what we're talking about, because I think that the question of removals can actually be different depending on whether we're a full service traditional funeral home that does all the bells and whistles for every funeral, or we're a cremation brand, right?
Right.
So I think for discussion, we're probably going to be talking more about the low cost cremation brand.
Sure.
But what are your thoughts on doing your own removals when you are a full service traditional brand?
I think that it's a good idea if you were a full service traditional brand to do your own removals and really own that process. We talk a lot about perceptual value when it comes to whatever services you are providing families. And for traditional funeral homes, I think it's really good to try to own the entire process, soup to nuts, and really have a high level of service from the beginning. And a lot of that kind of starts with a first call and that removal. So you can maybe provide that white glove service. And, I think the obvious point would be that you're doing a lot less cases, usually maybe, 1, 2, or 300 families a year. And you actually have the time to do those removals yourself or with one of your team members, because phones aren't that busy. So that's a reason enough to keep it in-house and do it yourself.
Mm-hmm. And I will say that I think to those listening or to those that will have an argument for some of your points on maybe we do outsource.
Sure.
If bandwidth wasn't an issue, and if costs and if everything wasn't an issue, I would probably say we would want to always do everything ourselves in-house.
I would agree. Yeah. I would agree.
But at a certain point, you do have to optimize your business. You have to do and understand what expenses and what values families look for when they're looking at this. And that may differ depending on the type of family, the type of case, and also the type of business you're running.
Yeah. And also the leadership capabilities at the top too. If you're undertaking an endeavor of building out a removal team, if you're not well versed in how to manage those types of schedules and things like that, it just might be something better left not taken on. And that can be okay.
Yeah. Okay. So why don't we start from I would say like beginning, right? Okay. Let's say we are a new cremation brand.
Mm-hmm.
We are starting our business. There's probably 1, maybe 2 employees there right now.
Yep.
I'm assuming you don't have your own crematory yet.
Right.
How would you start that in like your first, let's say 0 to 30 cases a month?
It's a great question. I think that with 1 or 2 employees and already outsourcing your own cremations, I would plan to outsource your removals as well. Removals can be so unpredictable that you could be setting yourself up for poor customer experiences if you don't start outsourcing those from the beginning. For instance, if you get a death call at a residence at 2:00 in the afternoon, but you've scheduled arrangements at 3 and 4, then you basically set yourself up to have to cancel those appointments or offload them or kind of fail that day just because so much of that first call aspect and removal aspect is unpredictable and you don't want to lose any cases. So I would strive to set up your business with outsourcing from the get-go. Now, that doesn't mean poor customer experience. And this is kind of what I like to get at when I talk about using third-party removal services. A lot of the times I get flack from funeral directors saying that using non-funeral directors to do removals is part of a disposal service. It's part of cheapening the process and cheapening the experience. However, I think that that can be the case only when you're a poor leader and poor manager. When outsourcing your third-party removals, you can make a checklist of things that you want the removal service to go over with families and do's and don'ts of what you want your brand to do at each of those removals with families. So it's not something that you outsource and you're stuck with however that driver does their removals. You can talk to those drivers and their management to get a more customized experience for your removals and maybe not other companies' removals. We did that. We provided a brochure that we wanted our drivers to hand out when they went to residence calls. And it was next step instructions that we customized, but we made sure every month we printed 200 or so and put them in big envelopes so that they could put them in their van so that when they did a call for us, they knew, okay, Omega has next steps instructions that we need to give to the family. And that way we mitigate questions that those drivers don't know the answers to. And we answer the questions on that sheet, often just telling them not to answer the questions or not to ask the drivers questions, but to save them for us the next day.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's really good advice. I think most people would think, third-party service, I have no control over that. I'm not going to use them. They're not going to do what I want or ask the questions that I need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that is often the case, but I think that's really just emblematic of a conversation that could be easily had and iterating on a process pretty simply and getting those third-party services in a much better place to serve your families and deliver on your brand's first experience with these families.
Okay. So before we move along, I kind of want to set up ground rules, but understanding of what we think is a reasonable cost here.
Okay.
Because let's just say on these high volume types of businesses, I would say that an average cost of $1,000 for your contract total is where it probably is going to be, maybe a little bit lower.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're already outsourcing your cremation, which can be, I don't know, $200 to $300.
I was going to say, call it $250. Yeah.
Okay. So if you're already paying for the outsourced cremation and now you need a removal company to come in, you're looking at a $900 contract total. What can we expect to be making, right? Especially if we're a new brand looking into building out this, low cost cremation brand, which is obviously a volume game. It's not a high end multi, tens of thousands of dollars type of funeral.
Yeah.
So, what type of margin do you think we're looking at here that would even make sense for a new brand to expect?
Yeah. So I'll answer this as if I'm in like Southern California, because that's what I know. When I've talked to other cremation brands around the country, I realized that the cost for third-party removal services ranges widely from, our cost at Omega for a local pickup was like most of my career, $70, which was very inexpensive. But then, and that's why I asked about the volume, because if we're giving that company 150 cases a month, then hey, give us a bit of a kind of a volume discount. But if I were looking at a new brand and negotiating that contract, I would say in Southern California, you're looking at an average removal cost of somewhere between $100 and $150, depending on the distance. And a lot of these removal services do usually a flat fee plus a per mile fee from the pickup location to your facility, which is kind of why I suggest to lower that overall cost. If you're operating in a certain geographical area, it is a good idea to find removal services in every county that you serve so that they become kind of the central location and you actually lower the distance. Because if you're sending every driver out from the same point, then it's more miles and you end up paying more. So you can mitigate that cost by having a network that you work with. And I would say you're looking at $100 to $150 per removal, maybe $200 if you're doing a lot of on the outskirts or you get kind of screwed in that negotiation. But I would advise trying to set up for future volume discounts. Like you plan to grow at this price, reevaluate things like that.
So we're looking at costs before you even see a dollar, like $400 when we're talking about doing outsourcing the cremation and the removal.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's still you're left with like 60%.
So I guess you've kind of given us an idea of why you would do that, because the time, your availability to like meet a family and then do a pickup are probably not possible in a day, or you'd have to have perfect a call in the morning and then an arrangement in the afternoon so that you can make that work. And we all know that, you'll get 2 death calls today and not a call for like 4 days, and then you'll get another 2. So
right. There's just too much unpredictability, and I think it's worth planning for that and accounting for that, because you're gonna keep 5-star experiences if you deliver on your appointments and deliver on your arrangement conferences and are able to answer the phone and not actually out making removals. And you also don't want to be answering the phone for customers while you're on a removal either. That's a pretty poor experience. So,
okay. So let's move it up then. Like let's just say you're doing, anywhere from 30 to 60 or cases a month.
Okay.
At what point do you think it makes sense to even venture into thinking like, okay, maybe I need to have my own removal person, or I need to start incorporating removals into my own business, with maybe another employee?
That's a great question. So I think what you're looking at is what I would look at first is a case breakdown. So how many removals are you doing that require one person, and how many removals are you doing that require 2? So for our business, we had one removal driver, and he handled essentially as many of the removals from hospitals and coroner's office, which only required one person and there was no family present. So we kind of leveraged one person's salary to do a lot of that work in-house. And then any call that we would get at a residence, we would outsource. That's how we broke it down. I would first do the analysis of how your cases are broken down, with where they were referred from and what type of removal it is. And, if you're 90% residence calls, then it might be worth hiring 2 people so that you could take on a significant portion of those residence calls with a fixed schedule with 2 people. But if you're getting, 30% or so from coroners and hospitals, then, maybe hiring one person just to take care of all that 30% would be great.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing, and I think is really interesting, is even if you're doing a low-cost cremation, a direct cremation, even those have a lot of variances in which you can optimize your business towards.
Oh, yeah. Big time.
maybe you can give us a brief understanding. I know you just mentioned it, but like in a more in-depth understanding of what you guys were doing at Omega Society.
Sure. So let's take like an average day where we would get 10 death calls. So most of our referrals or most of our cases and families came from residences attended death by hospices. I would say somewhere between 60 and 70%, let's call it, 70%. So 7 out of 10. And let's say the rest were like 2 hospitals and 1 coroner for 8, 9, and then 10, the 10th call. So those 7 calls require two people to do the removal. We would outsource those. Now, the other 3 at hospitals, of course, you need a release form and so on from signed by the family. But assuming you had those, that's what our in-house driver would spend his day doing. He would spend his day. He would come in and see, okay, what releases do we have for any cases at hospitals or coroner's offices? And he would line up his day based on the best logistical route and go take those pieces of paper and go make those removals. And our van fit up to 4 cases. So he could make removals for up to 4 hospitals or 4 bodies, bring them back and, do another round if we had more releases and he had the time in the day. And if there wasn't a full day of removals for him to do, we would have him do ad hoc logistical help with anything that we needed administratively. Like if he knew he was going to have half of the afternoon free, we'd send him with a bundle of non-contagious disease letters for the health department to sign, or apostles for, cases going out of state, things like that. So we tried to, really use him with as much advantageous like effort as we could based on kind of what we had available for him that day for removals, and would just backfill whatever else we needed from the office. And he could just do that running around since he was already used to being out and liked being out. So that's what an average day would look like, for us.
Which I think is really interesting because I know we just talked to Pierce and he mentioned that they have their entire removals done by them. They control that entire experience, which I'm sure does aid a lot in giving a very consistent and very careful experience to every family that interacts with them, because they have control over that whole situation. But also, what are some of the cons that come with having an entire removals team internally?
Yeah, so I think first off, I give Leaf and Pierce a whole lot of kudos for doing that and managing that team. I think he shows tremendous amount of leadership, he and his dad, to do that and build that out and keep it at the level of satisfaction that they do. And I think that they do a good job with their leadership and proactive nature to mitigate a lot of the cons. But some of the cons would be managing a bigger team. And if you don't build out that team or don't proactively think about the other externalities and time constraints and time commitments that managing another team and complaints is going to bring, I think you could be setting yourself up for some squeaky wheels, I guess, some issues at some point. Doing your own removals also gives you more liability exposure. You're making removals from homes, and that is a sensitive experience, and you can actually legally do some mitigation of liability by outsourcing that. Also saves on time, especially if you're a smaller firm. If you have someone that, a lot of the times what I see is like someone is really good at doing 2 things. It's like filing death certificates, calling doctors, or meeting with families, and they're really good at removals. So if you have them doing removals, you're also probably losing the best person that knows how to file your death certificates, know how causes should be arranged on a death certificate to get it approved by the county, those types of things. So you can lose efficiencies by not outsourcing it. But again, like Pierce, that's just a dedicated team. So if you are going to do your own removals, I would say plan to have a dedicated removal team that exclusively does removals. You train them, you retrain them, you continuously train them and manage expectations. That's how I would do it successfully. Like Pierce.
Did you ever run numbers at Omega of like what it would cost and how much like if you were to include your own removals team, or was that something that you guys just really never considered?
It wasn't something that we considered. We did run the numbers on hiring one additional removal driver to do residence calls during the day. We really kind of just didn't want to manage hands-on that 24-hour business. We wanted to have just someone on call, and we knew that whatever removal company they called was going to be outsourced, and the decedent was going to be in our care in the morning, and our team would follow up from there. It's not a scheduling thing that we were proactive about, feeling out and doing. It's just something we weren't interested in. And I think a lot of that had to do with our pricing power in terms of getting those mitigated costs for outsourcing.
Yeah.
So, it was pretty inexpensive for us relatively to outsource cremations or outsource removals. And those removal drivers generally did a really good job, and families were happy, and we would get kudos saying the guy who came and picked up my mom was so lovely. And when you hear that and it's relatively inexpensive, it's not broken, don't fix it.
Okay. We had talked before we started recording, about talking about the different stages of when you should or should not hire a removal company. And I think as we've been talking, I think it really just depends on what risks you're willing to take on, what type of management you are, what your volume can be, the type of breakdown of removals. And I think you've kind of mentioned good advice on all of those. So I think what might be more interesting or more valuable for us to talk about right now is like, you guys, it sounds like you have evaluated many different removal companies, right? You had ones for different areas to optimize that. So what was a good way of vetting the removal person or the removal company when you were choosing those to represent yourself or represent your brand?
Great question. You want a removal company that has a relatively robust team. They're more likely to be able to do the removal, and they're more likely to answer the phone when you call. Because there were times where we had multiple removal companies that we could call in each county in which we operated, but we also knew which ones were first choices and which ones were backups. And the first choices were mainly removal companies that we knew would answer the phone when we called the first time to give them the information to do the removal. And we knew that they could have enough team members in their crew awake and on call to send someone out immediately. So you want them to be prepared at any time of day to do removals, which the good ones are. But then you do get a lot of removal companies that are really just one guy doing removals, and he has one van, one guy, and basically his schedule is only his own. So I would be wary of that. You also want someone that gets good reviews from families. If you are using a removal service, you can do it on a trial basis for a time period or just a number of removals. And what you want to see is getting kudos from families unsolicited about the removal experience. And what you don't want is them saying, he showed up in flip-flops and, a Hawaiian t-shirt and was like throwing my mom around, didn't care, you don't want those things. So then you don't use those companies again. The ones who do well, you use again and make sure that they know business is going to come to them. That's really what they want to hear.
Okay, well, let's talk about that. You've mentioned just now about getting unsolicited kudos, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that to keep the cohesiveness of the experience, you probably don't want to just tell families, hey, we use a third-party service to pick up. But as a feedback loop, you really do want to ask families about that. What would be a good way of trying to figure out, how was I guess you could ask, how was your experience, or what was your experience like, not with the removal company, but with your first interaction?
Yeah, you could just do that. We value feedback, and we want to hear how your first interaction went with our business to see if there's anything that we could improve upon, and ask about how was the experience when we brought your mom into our care. And I would probably take time to workshop that question or line of questions to really get at what feedback we're trying to get from the family and what those responses actually tell us about the removal company and that experience. Mm-hmm. because you'd want stuff about the experience, the appearance of the driver, the appearance of the vehicle as well. But those things should be things that you inspect prior. It's a really good idea that if you're hiring a new removal company, to talk to the manager of the team and meet as many of the drivers as you can yourself to make it more personable, as well as see what vehicles they use. Some fleets have like 2 new vehicles and then 1 old guy. And it's like, hey, for my removals, I really only want these 2 vehicles used. Mm-hmm. That's stuff that is really good to kind of flush out and ask and make sure that your expectations about what they should be doing with your removals is clear.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think the biggest argument is always going to be, that when you use a removal company, that you are not controlling that experience. And I think you've shown that you can successfully use it, but it's going to take a lot more work. It's not like you can just call a random company and expect them to provide the level of care that you may expect. There are things that you can do to, try to push them to do certain things to more fit what you're trying to provide. And I don't think you should be shy about asking that. I mean, they are technically working for you in that moment. So you should be able to request certain things that will help, and you shouldn't settle for just anybody.
I 100% agree. It's going to do your brand a lot of good if you set those expectations early and often and are critical when things don't go. If you hear something that's not in line with what you asked or contracted them to do from a family, then you need to address it and be firm about addressing it. The good news is when a third-party removal service does mess up, a lot of the times you don't have to like manage someone or fire. You can fire the removal service, but a lot of the time you're telling the manager, hey, they messed this up. Then they can go back and see who did that removal and take the appropriate action for that individual themselves in their own business, which is kind of nice. It's less management for you, because you're the customer at that point. You should always be happy as a customer.
Yeah. I mean, I think you've shown that you can get hundreds, if not thousands of 5-star reviews from the family experience. But do you think that families that are looking for maybe a lower cost cremation, direct cremation, are expecting less of that experience too? No. Do you think they know, or do you think they value, having someone with a shirt that says Omega Society when they come pick them up? Or do you think they value their loved one being put into a nicer looking vehicle? Like, where do you think that starts to matter? Is it cost? Is it type of family? Or do you think at that point they're just okay as long as things go smoothly, the person is nice, and they seem to be taking care of the loved one?
I guess what I'll say is the vast majority of families don't care after a certain level of base expectations are met. And if those base level of expectations are met, it's a 10 out of 10 experience or 9.5 out of 10 experience. And the showing up in a tuxedo with tails and white gloves may make it a 9.9 out of 10. But it's actually not that important, because so much of what they really care about is way, way, way less about delivering on that type of like white glove service. They want to make sure that the person shows up on time, or when they say they're going to show up. They expect a level of courteousness from that person to introduce themselves, express their condolences, to maneuver within their home with care, not moving crap around, banging stuff. If they have to do something with the body that may be unconventional, like using the sheet that's often in a medical bed to lift onto the gurney, taking the time to bring the wife aside and say, ma'am, I don't want you to be startled. We're going to remove your husband by using the sheet just because it's easier and more gentle that way. We wanted to prepare you by just taking you aside before we do it. Okay. And then they say, wow, this person actually cares about my humanity, and they're willing to take the 15 seconds so that they don't scare the crap out of me. And as long as you do those things, then you created a good experience to start this process with that family. And that goes basically the whole way.
I see. I mean, I would say that those that would argue with you, or that would argue this point, would say that this is almost going to be the first in-person interaction that you're going to have with that family, or that family with your business.
Yep.
And that it's too important to outsource.
Okay. I mean, I would say, tell me what you do on a first call that is extremely related to your brand, that's different from what should be done on a first call. I think that there may, like, if you're saying that, like, if you're trying to do the arrangement at the home, I would say, I don't think that's a great image. I would prefer to have one of my counselors do that the next day, rather than asking for the military discharge papers at 2:00 in the morning on a removal call. And I encourage people to say in the comments what they do on their removals that prove the validation of their cost to families that they charge, or delivering on a brand experience for the first call. What does that entail for you that maybe I'm not speaking to? But I definitely just try to not screw up the basics and be really nice.
I see. Okay. I mean, I can understand that, and I would agree with that. And I think one of the points that some might miss is that you really need to vet your removal company.
Yeah.
And that there's going to be different ones that provide different levels of experience, and that it's probably on you to, even though it is a third party, you still need to almost treat them as like a secondary employee.
Yeah. I mean, if your mind goes to, I outsource my removals, which means I don't care about removals, like, do whatever you want as long as you get the decedent in my care, I don't care. That's not how I would say that you should approach it. You should approach it with immense care, so that you can actually mitigate the time that you actually have to spend managing that process. Proactively write out the list of expectations that every driver should execute on every single removal, do's and don'ts of your brand's removal, what kind of attire you want them to be in, what kind of van you don't want them to be in, what kind of vehicle you do want them to be in, depending on how that breaks down in their business, what information to take, what information not to take that you'll take the next day when you reach out, all those things. So this is really a process question. It's, if you take the time to develop a perspective about how you want your removals to be done, I think that it's fair to communicate that with a third party and come up with an agreement of what you think is fair to pay that subcontracted service to do and execute those things for your business, and manage them accordingly.
I would agree. I mean, I think that, without diving too deep into it, that you do feel like you may lose the experience, or that people would be quick to say that you don't no longer control that experience. But at the end of the day, these are going to be your vendors that you can request and, even demand from to work with you, right? So it is definitely something that you need to look into deeper than just saying, okay, I found a removal company in the phone book or on Google, and we're going to use them, right?
And also, like, if your point is like, this is the first experience, then okay, do all of the residence calls where family is present with your own team. But there's no reason to outsource the rest, because you're just dealing with hospital security and nursing administrator staff. It's not the family necessarily. So what justification would you have there?
I don't know. I'm sure there's going to be some.
I'm sure. And that's fine. If you think that you are the best removal artist in the entire world, then by all means do it. Fine. Yes. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm just giving you an opinion. I'm just a guy in the world.
Yes, I agree. Okay. Is there anything that you else wanted to talk about? I mean, I think this will be one of our shorter ones, but I think it's just, we're going to be doing more of these where we kind of just break down smaller parts of a death call or the arrangement, and just kind of go over them a little bit more in depth. In summary, I think it's really just very particular about what you want your brand to be about and what you can actually handle managerially and as an owner, and just where your limitations are staffing wise and your ability to grow your team and your bandwidth. I think it is dependent on that. And a lot of the other reasons to say yes or no may actually fundamentally be about your willingness to lead or
have a bigger team or not. So I think that kind of is an underlying driver as well.
Makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Will.
You got it.
We'll definitely have more of these. Well, thank you for sharing these insights. And I think that for these, you are one person. You have your set of experiences. There's going to be others that have others experiences and other opinions. And I think they're just as valid. And if you would like to,
Mix and
reach
match.
out or have a discussion, let's go ahead and do that.
Let's do it.
Where we definitely don't have that ego where we think that what we say is always right.
Yeah.
So we welcome comments.
There's a million ways to do it, and you got to find a way that works for you. And I hope that we could at least shine light on expanding options for you and your team when outsourcing at the very least.
I mean, even on the guests that we've had, right? You and I would say Leafit, Pierce, you guys have similar businesses serving similar families, and you guys have gone about it completely different ways. Yeah. And in the same way, you are still providing excellent experiences. You're still gaining the same amount of, I don't want to call it notoriety, but your businesses still look just as good online if you were to compare each other. And so I don't think there is one correct answer here.
I agree. I think that's the moral of the story, All
right, cool, Will. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been the Direct Cremation Podcast. I'm Tyler Yamasaki. This is my co-host, Will DeMichaelis, and we will catch you next time.
Take it easy, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you ever want to know more, please find us at directcremation.com.